Hello and welcome to the Legends Department at the New Republic Centralized Archives on Coruscant. Here, the less than canonical entries in galactic history are read, researched, and reviewed. My name is Rin, and I'm one of the researchers here specializing in Legends literature. I know I don't have the accent you would expect from a Coruscanti academic, for the very simple reason that I am Corellian, thank you very much. And I haven't been on the planet very long, but I'm here now with a new project. Okay, never mind all that, and allow me to actually introduce myself. My name is Rin, and this program is chronicling my exploration, or re-exploration as the case might be, of Star Wars Legends, otherwise known as the Expanded Universe. Perhaps I should say formerly known as, but hey, it's what they called it when I started reading it. You see, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and by that I mean the year 2000 in a Borders bookstore in California, I stumbled across a $5 copy of the Phantom Menace novelization by Terry Brooks. It was that hardcover edition that had a variety of dust jacket options, so as soon as I spotted Queen Amidala, I grabbed it, I bought it, I brought it home, and I didn't read it. But guess who did? My mom, and somehow that completely changed the trajectory of my family's fandom preferences. We went from general science fiction fans who were pretty casual about Star Wars to Star Wars fans with bookcases full of EU novels to prove it. I did eventually get around to reading The Phantom Menace, by the way, along with many, many other expanded universe titles. Some of those novels still have a place on my list of all-time favorite stories. Still, as that continuity wound down, I did not keep up. I'm almost ashamed to admit that I really only bothered with Star Wars theatrical releases for quite some time, and few of those inspired me to dig any deeper. That changed some years back. I like to joke that I got Disney Plus for The Mandalorian but kept it to rewatch Rebels, but it's a joke without a punchline, so the point is I started to catch up. Despite my earlier comment on theatrical releases, there is a lot in the new canon of Star Wars that I like. If I can get through whatever future discussion we have on Heir to the Empire without repeatedly mentioning my undying love of the Ascendancy trilogy, well, that will be a miracle. But in between Andor and the High Republic and Ahsoka and ever more new stories on the horizon, I found myself yearning to return to the books that first captured my imagination in the Star Wars universe. And so here we are. I'll be looking at the novels of Star Wars Legends one book at a time in publication order. I originally did most of my reading in roughly chronological order, at least in regards to the classic through New Jedi Order eras, but I think it'll be interesting to track the evolution of the stories as they originally unfolded. The exception to this is series that were published concurrently. We'll stick with one storyline and then move on to the next consecutively. In other words, no duologies, trilogies, or series broken up without good reason. I may in fact find a good reason, but I don't know what that would be. I'm going to assume a fair amount of familiarity with the storylines covered and not offer exhaustive summaries. I did try to write some exhaustive summaries, but I bored even myself, so I decided not to subject anyone else to that. In general, I'll open our discussion with some real-world, maybe some in-universe context, and then move on to my personal comments and opinions. My interest tends to lie with characterization, world building, so that'll likely be my primary focus. And again, most of what I have to say is simply opinion. I have no claim to expertise, and I am undoubtedly more of an enthusiast than a critic. It's my hope that I'll come away from my project here with some new favorite stories, and perhaps you will as well. One last warning before we jump into our Legends adventure. As you've probably already guessed, there will be spoilers. Certainly for the specific books being discussed, but very likely for related stories as well. I will try to be cognizant of not jumping ahead of myself, but realistically, most of what I'll be looking at is at least a decade old. And in addition to Legends spoilers, there's always the possibility that I will tie in more recent developments in current lore, so basically, I will try to be considerate, but nothing is sacred. If you can find it on Wikipedia, I'm not going to hesitate to bring it up here. And on that note, let me welcome you once again to the Legends Department. How beautiful was the universe, Luke thought. How beautifully flowing, glorious and aglow like the robe of a queen. Ice-black clean in its emptiness and solitude, so unlike the motley collage of spinning dust motes men called their worlds. where the human bacteria throve, and multiplied, and slaughtered one another, all so that one might say he stood a little higher than his fellows. So opened Splinter of the Mind's Eye by Alan Dean Foster, released in 1978. And the timing on that is important because Splinter was written while A New Hope was still in production before anyone knew how wildly successful the movie would be. When George Lucas commissioned Mr. Foster to write the story, he wanted something that could possibly work as a movie sequel, and therefore took into account the situation as it then stood. Harrison Ford hadn't signed a contract for a second film, so Han Solo doesn't appear in the story. Neither does Chewbacca because, well, let's face it, the two kind of go together. The assumption was that any future movies would have a limited budget, so the action is contained to a few vaguely atmospheric locations. Oh, and here's a big one. Since Leia's identity as a Skywalker hadn't been settled on, Splinter of the Mind's Eye ramps up the romantic tension between her and Luke. Yeah, if that kiss in Empire makes you cringe, good times are ahead. This is the story in brief. About 2 years after the Battle of Yavin, Luke and Leia, along with R2 and 3PO, are stranded after crash landing on the out-of-the-way planet of Mimban. They find that the sparse population is, surprise, surprise, under Imperial control. As they try to find their way off-world, they meet a local Force-sensitive woman named Hala and join her quest to find the near-mythical Kyber crystal. This crystal focuses Force energy to help its wielder accomplish great feats, including, though apparently not limited to, healing. It's languishing in some rotting temple somewhere on the planet, and Luke and Leia agree that it cannot be allowed to fall into the hands of the Empire. Their quest is almost immediately derailed because Luke and Leia have no idea how to be discreet or, in fact, how to act like proper adults at all. They're captured by Imperials, but then break out of jail, threatened by monsters on 3 separate occasions, run afoul of, but then befriend and fight alongside the primitive natives, and finally face off against Darth Vader in the last chapter. They also engage in petty theft, a brawl, and more instances of what I hesitate to deem belligerent romantic tension than I care to recount. Oh, and Luke picks up 2 alien sidekicks along the way, but they're both dead by the end of the book, so it doesn't really matter. And Leia has multiple panic attacks. We conclude with the crystal having been found, Hala learning the meaning of true, selfless friendship, Luke killed, but then resurrected, Leia injured, but then healed of her wounds, both life-threatening and cosmetic, and Vader having fallen into a deep chasm to be dealt with on another day, I guess. 3PO inexplicably gets the last line, even though he and R2 otherwise contributed very little to the story. Why do I have the impression everyone is laughing at me? Indeed. So, what's good about Splinter of the Mind's Eye? This was one of the first EU adult novels I read, and the only thing that really stuck in my memory was Luke inadvertently lusting after his sister. But coming back to it now, it really is a fascinating time capsule, and it's fun to see some of those early concepts at play. The most notable of these is perhaps the Kyber crystal. Its role and makeup here are very different from the strongest stars have hearts of Kyber crystals of the current canon. But the basic idea that the crystal is attuned to the Force is there. This crystal works as a kind of Force amplifier, if you will, but it doesn't seem to react to other types of energy, so probably not going to be powering any Death Stars. As an interesting side note, the Kyber crystal in Splinter of the Mind's Eye is depicted as red, but we won't read too much into that. There are some other minor parallels to what we see in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. The planet Mimban, which is now canon of course, with its primarily muddy and foggy set dressing, has suggestions of Dagobah about it, especially in the opening chapters. Later on, we meet some of the native inhabitants of Mimban, the Kowe. Their introduction and subsequent teaming up with our heroes definitely calls to mind the Ewoks, and while the Kowe are decidedly more bloodthirsty than everyone's favorite space teddy bears, we still get to see Imperials bested by technologically backwards locals. Speaking of Imperials, they were another good point for me. For the first part of the novel, our antagonist is just the everyday Imperial system. We're on a backwards planet with third-rate troops and fourth-rate officers. We're not facing the Death Star and the sophisticated menace of Tarkin. These guys are breaking up bar fights and strip mining a planet, and it shows. Our senior officers, Captain Supervisor Grimmel and the briefly seen Governor Asada, are admittedly grotesques, Grasping and theatrically cruel, there's not much more to either character than that. But it's the other Imperials we see that are worth considering a little deeper. First, we have the officer who arrests Luke and Leia after they brawl with some local miners. He likes to find out the local history of wherever he's stationed. Then there's the doctor who shows up in a brief interlude. She's indifferent to being in Imperial service, but does her best to save all kinds of lives. Then there's a sergeant left on guard duty after the Battle of the Koei. He thinks critically about the mistakes of the battle, taking a realistic and sympathetic view of his troops. Okay, that said, don't expect too nuanced of a portrayal here. Apart from perhaps the doctor, all of these little glimpses of humanity end the same way. The character falls back into the expected cruelty. That last sergeant I mentioned there, he comforted himself by speculating on the forthcoming massacre that would take place in the native warrens below. So, at the end of the day, they're just the bad guys, but there's those little flashes that are intriguing. This highlighting of banal evil, or punch card villainy, has become increasingly common in newer Star Wars media, but it stands out in this earlier iteration of the galaxy. As a final point in Splinter's favor, there is some legitimately decent writing. I'm not going to say this is an artistic masterpiece, but Mr. Foster paints some interesting pictures, and he has some pretty turns of phrase. Admittedly, some of these bits of polish seem a little out of place, and as the story progresses, can read more absurd than engaging. At one point, after Luke almost suffocates in a pond, he thinks to himself, "Air most delicious of gases." So there is a bit of a downward trend. But overall, there are places where the prose can really suck you in. The same does not hold true for the dialogue, alas. But that has more to do with our next point, characterization. Alright, this is where we move on from the what's good section into, well, the rest of my comments. As I mentioned earlier, Han and Chewie are nowhere to be seen in this story, and that's probably a good thing because I would not have cared to see how they would have been shoehorned into the plot. But it also means that there aren't many characters for Luke and Leia to play off of. Hala, the various Imperials and locals, the alien sidekicks, the droids, even the ones who have important plot functions don't bring much to the table. There's no Obi-Wan Kenobi or Tarkin or Lando. Honestly, Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru played more meaningful roles in a few minutes of screen time than anyone we're introduced to here. So that really just leaves us with Luke and Leia, and both characterizations are rocky. In Luke, we have a few interesting contrasts that serve the plot more than anything. This Luke is very well educated. Street smart, yes, but he also has a good grasp of different languages, cultures, various sciences. He specifically states that most of his studies happened back on the farm because he had the time and the interest. And you know what? I'll buy it. One day this guy is going to rebuild the Jedi Order through effort and a lot of research, so fine. Luke is a secret academic. Practically speaking, what this means is that Luke is the person who knows the most of the time. Okay, so he's our hero. But it just doesn't quite ring true. Leia at one point says, "For an untutored country boy, you're one of the most sophisticated men I know." I can only conclude that the majority of sophisticated men of the galaxy were on Alderaan when it was destroyed. What other explanation could there be for a comment like this? The other interesting thing about Luke here is how often we're told he's good and kind. But when we see his actions, yes, he's good, I suppose. He's filled with righteous indignation by how badly the Imperials treat the locals, and later he's horrified how violently the locals massacre the Imperials, and so on and so forth. Good? Maybe. Kind? At one point, Luke is forced to participate in trial by combat by the Koei. Obviously, he's interested in winning, but he's also really annoyed when Hala and Leia bring out various altruistic reasons why he needs to succeed. He says, "It's more important in the end that I go on living." Okay. Maybe his life is more important than saving his friends or making sure they can continue their various critical to the fate of the galaxy missions. But it sounds more like early Han Solo instead of second installment Luke Skywalker. There's also a number of instances where Luke intentionally uses his anger to give himself a little push. Or in one case, he encourages Leia to do the same. And true, we see those flashes of irritation and anger in Luke throughout the original trilogy. But here, it's a motivating force for him and a tool that he consciously uses. And it just doesn't quite gel. That said, his crowning sin here is that he doesn't grow in this story at all. If anything, it's his less than desirable traits that help him win the day. But if Luke's character was rocky, Leia's is a rock slide just shy of disaster. Sure, we still get any number of snarky comebacks, but mostly she just feels like a princess in peril. More so here than she did in A New Hope, where she was literally a prisoner in need of rescue. Now, to be fair, the author makes it very clear that Leia repeatedly suffers flashbacks and panic attacks stemming from that imprisonment on the Death Star. But I don't think a nuanced portrayal of PTSD was the goal here. It feels like it just gave him some justification for Leia to swoon, try to run away at inopportune moments, and have screaming fits. There's also a number of occasions where she stumbles, again literally, into situations where Luke needs to pull her to safety. There's also a rather jarring scene early on where Luke and Leia are trying to scope out an Imperial mining settlement that they found. They go into a local eatery, Leia starts to panic that their cover has been blown, and Luke smacks her across the face and pretends that she's his slave so she doesn't bolt. Then, to compound this uncomfortable tableau, Leia retaliates a little while later by kicking Luke into the mud. In probably the most sibling-like dynamic demonstrated in this book, Luke in turn retaliates by pulling her down into the mud with him. Wrestling ensues, and it draws the attention of a few of the miners. Originally, they're all for Luke teaching his slave girl a lesson just because, but as her clothing has become strategically disheveled, their interest turns a bit more sinister. This is where we end up with the brawl that leads to Luke and Leia being taken into Imperial custody, and it just feels like bad Leia characterization from beginning to end. Things do take a bit of an upward turn during the novel's final act, where her feistiness turns into, well, somewhat understandable bloodlust. She is determined to kill Vader. During the battle with the Koei, she makes Luke swear that he will leave Vader to her. She wants to be the one that takes him out. Now, her resolve is somewhat undermined by the fact that she's referred to as a steel kitten in this particular scene, but the motivation stays true. And probably her best moment of the book, she's the one that starts dueling with Vader. It's pretty cool, albeit inevitably short. And that kind of sums up her role in this book. We see Leia be briefly competent, but then she's derailed either by circumstances that it seems like she should be able to overcome, or just because she has no real control over herself. And okay, she's like 21 here, but I sure wouldn't be trusting her with any delicate negotiations, which is the whole premise of how the story opens. Overall, I'd say that Luke and Leia both feel like a product of the book's era, which is ironic because part of the magic of the original film trilogy is that they sidestep that to a degree. The characters feel timeless, and that just doesn't come across here. Oh, and one last comment on characterization. We don't see much of Vader, but when we do, he is just shy of being a pantomime villain. It's really hard to feel menaced by him, even though his actions are that of a credible threat. It's just hard to take him seriously when he says things like, "Your existence befouls me," or "Foolish infant, the Force is with me, not you." Other than that, we do get a brief hint of Vader's Empire Strikes Back era penchant for murdering disappointing subordinates. No detachedly menacing Force chokes, however. Rather, one unlucky Imperial meets his end by Vader's lightsaber in a scene that I felt would have been more suited to, say, Kylo Ren? What can you do? Another aspect of the novel I wasn't crazy about was, towards the middle, it starts to feel like a low-stakes creature feature. Sure, all the movies in the original trilogy have at least one monster, if you will. There's the Dianoga, then the Wampa, and of course the Sarlacc. But that's 3 monsters spread out over 3 movies, ultimately with very little screen time. Here we have a hungry giant worm, a murderous lake blob, and an armored toad-like lizard thing with lots of teeth and lightsaber impervious skin in what feels like quick succession. And maybe if this had been made into a film, one of those monsters would have been selected and the rest ignored, but in the novel, it feels like a bit much. Besides, I think it's safe to say that there are very few Star Wars fans who look back and say, man, that Wampa scene, that's what made Empire so great. This all boils down to the question, is Splinter of the Mind's Eye worth reading? I would say, sure. It's fast, it's silly. Overall, there's a part of me that views Splinter of the Mind's Eye as almost an alternate universe. It gives us a hint of what might have been rather than what came to be. And I think we're all pretty grateful that we ended up with The Empire Strikes Back instead. But even after that, it's worth noting that for years, this was the only novel to shed any light on the time between episodes 4 and 5. It wasn't until 2003 that The Ruins of Dantooine, set 1 year after the Battle of Yavin, was released as a tie-in to the Star Wars Galaxies video game. But even that didn't follow Luke, Leia, or Han. That didn't come for another 10 years until Razor's Edge was released in 2013. So really, for 35 years, Splinter of the Mind's Eye was it. That, combined with the fact that it was the first of hundreds of novels in the Star Wars universe, makes it unique and I think worth a look. Thank you everyone who listened through to this point. First episodes are always a bit of a shot in the dark, but I hope you had fun on our first look into the Legends department here at the archive and will join us next time. And tell me, the first time you saw New Hope, where did you want the story to go? Leave a comment if the platform you're listening on has them available, or you can find me at Legends Department on Instagram and TikTok. Until next time, friends, may the Force be with you.